All right, we'll call the meeting to order here at 8:03 a.m. See everybody. We will jump in. First item with old business. I was wondering if we haven't done an update on the water bill situation, and so the town administrator mentioned it at a committee meeting.
Great. Yeah.
In terms of the number, I know we had asked you a side question last school committee, but can you just provide that?
Yes. Apologies, because I received an update. It was actually last week that we received the update. So there was an error on the meter at the high school. And so they calculated what the refund was going to be. And so the total amount due to the school department was just over $88,000. Of the total, $62,000 related to fiscal year 25. So that will just be a credit directly to the water bill account for the high school. So that will impact our balance for this year, which is a positive thing. And we had been using that as one of the measures to try to close that, the deficit. And then a portion of it, it's $25,703 actually relates to prior years. So that money, because it is a prior year credit, that goes to the town's general fund. And then at the end of the year, because it's revenue that was not originally projected to be part of the revenue received during the year, it would essentially close out and be certified as free cash in the upcoming year. So again, the total is just over $88,000. It's $88,149.98. And that the other portion that will help us for this year is that we were carrying projections for the last 2 quarters based off of the billing that had already occurred. And so we're able to adjust that to show that the outstanding expenses are going to be more in line with the bills that we had paid for previous fiscal years. So that's a good thing as well.
So do you have a sense between the credit we'll receive and the reduction in the projections, what total impacts to the project? Because I think you had 72,000. We had 72,000. What came back? What's your original projection? Something about that.
I don't have the exact number. I can pull that for you. So I am at the same time working on the quarterly report as of March 31st. And so that information will be in the quarterly report. So when I actually have the numbers, the specific numbers, I just don't have the spreadsheet in front of me. I can provide that detailed information as a part of the quarterly report. So I think for that number, and for that line specifically, the water line at the high school, originally we were projecting that we were going to be, I believe it was $100,000 over budget, but now given the credit and the adjustments for the next 2 quarters, we should be within budget. So it could essentially be $100,000. That would be, the delta of the adjustment, which would again reduce that deficit projection for that of the year.
One bit of good news. Do you have the only other thing for FY25? Do you have any other updated information from the state?
So I actually just got an email this morning, and I'm just gonna pull that up as we're sitting here. I don't have really any documentation to share other than the bill. But I received an email from the executive director of the Massachusetts School Business Association. Late Monday, House Ways and Means proposed the supplemental budget. And 2 key pieces of that are the circuit breaker funding for this year. And then there's also continued funding for fiscal year 26. So there could be a positive impact for us for this year, for the circuit breaker funding for the transportation piece specifically. And then there could also be a positive impact for next year.
Meaning what?
So right now, for transportation, we are only receiving 44% of the reimbursement. For tuition, we are receiving 75%, which is the max that you can receive according to the program. For next year, they are allocating an additional $190 million for fiscal year 26 to make sure that those programs can both be fully funded, meaning that the total reimbursement will be 75% and not an amount less than that. And so again, this year for transportation, we're currently receiving 44% of the reimbursement. The hope is that that is increased to 75% of the reimbursement, and then the corresponding adjustment would be the 75% reimbursement for next year as well. So that it was just news as of Monday. And so as I receive more information, I'll definitely pass that along.
Could you forward that email?
Of
Just 'cause
course.
I think, consider something, say we could do that.
Yes.
Bill Driscoll and Richard, sure that's on the, something pushing forward.
And that there's definitely some urging too from the associations, from the executive directors, from everyone, just saying like, we need to keep this momentum, right? This is a great kind of, this is what we were hoping for, right? This is the action that we were hoping to be able, that our original advocacy was pushing for, but we need to make sure that we continue, because that was a huge piece of looking at some additional funding to be able to help some offset the deficit for this year as well. So yes, I can absolutely support that.
Sure. Thank you. And then the last bit, you said the quarter 3 report, you were working on, this maybe gets a bit into discussion next meeting, agendas. Is that something you think we would talk about Monday or Wednesday next week?
If we could do Wednesday, that would be great, just to give me a little more time to make sure I have everything.
Questions? On the 525. All right, FY26, we're going to jump first into the fee proposal. Just a reminder, this is the second round. We looked at the athletic fees, so this is kind of the remaining fees to try and finalize this here to then bring proposal to the next Wednesday.
I didn't update the date, I'm sorry, just ignore that date on this first page. So if it's okay, because Karen is here.
Yeah.
We've been working together, just looking at the fees really specific to the high school. So if it's okay, can we skip through community schools? We can go back to that, but we'll start with the middle school, high school student activity fees.
Yep.
So we've already, for the high school and the middle school, so at the secondary level, we have already looked at the athletic fees, knowing that increasing the fees would allow us to bring in some additional revenue to offset the cost for next fiscal year. During that process, we looked at a number of comparable districts, and we truly wanted to make sure that when we updated the fee that we were kind of in line with other districts, and that we were charging an appropriate amount to be able to increase that revenue, knowing that the cost of the officials increases every year, the cost of transportation increases, there's uniform needs, there's just a whole host of expenses associated with the program. So that was already done. So in a similar fashion, we looked at the middle school and high school student activity fees. And through the course of that work, as we reached out to other districts, as we tried to look at the data to be able to make a proposal based off of all of that information, it's not as, there isn't as much data available as there is for athletics. So schools handle student activities in a variety of different ways, and I think that's for a variety of reasons. And so rather than doing a blanket increase for the upcoming fiscal year, just based off of the information that we had, we are proposing to keep the student activity fees for the middle school and the high school as they currently are. But I think one area that we've looked at and that we've talked about is our theater and our drama programs. Mm-hmm. And we talked about potentially adding in doing 100, so adjusting the user fee to be reflective of $100 per production rather than just the $25 user fee. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we did that, and Karen, please, at any point in time, let me know, I don't want to misspeak, but really just in looking at the time commitment, the resources, the material, everything that goes into the productions at both the middle school and high school, knowing that our students that are participating are doing, I mean, they are the state champions, right? And so there is so much time and effort that goes into this. And so we were just trying to be mindful of that and saying, does it make more sense to do $100 user fee per production, knowing the costs that are associated and the time commitment, which we're seeing is in some instances similar to the athletic programs. Anything else?
No, you're right. I mean, I think the Stephen and Laura McCarran, who have seen the theater program, have done a phenomenal job with the program. The students, we all know they do a great job. But it's been a lot of work to get where they are as far as the materials and the resources that they're using as well, and scrapping things together and making it work. And with the increase in the fees, hopefully we'll be able to streamline that process and how we're using those materials. So I support this wholeheartedly. I mean, the students that they spend as much time here as many of us do, and their effort shows, it really does. So I support this as well.
I think it makes sense. I mean, having one of our PhD theater kids, now it's his career, you see it is a huge amount. It's a huge amount of time and effort. I mean, they're there a lot. And if you do compare it to being on the team sport, it's the time commitment and, you know, the coach, it's a more director, it's even more, right. And so, you know, I think it does make sense. And so this would be, would there be a family cap on this? No, so say there, that's something I would ask is like, is there a family cap similar to sports? If you had multiple cases here, high school, that is, or would it be?
I don't think it would get up to the same cap level though, would it? At this
No,
Yeah,
I would
not sure.
say it would be $500 family cap, just thinking. And I can look at that more, but that would be more in line with athletics. We're doing the 1,200. So I'd have to look at the number kind of like associated with that. But that would essentially be if you had 2 students that are participating in each one of the productions.
Well, there's the spring and the fall, and then students also choose to participate in the winter festival, which is what they just won.
Right.
The state cup, in. Not every student chooses to do all 3 productions. Sometimes they're more prone to the musicals versus the drama. That's why they've been doing more musicals as well, because it really pulls in the more students and whatnot. So it really, I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, no, that's
You
just,
know.
yeah.
I happen to work with Katie to figure out what an appropriate cap would be.
Yeah.
I mean, if that seems
It does.
realistic, I just.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I guess the question I have is, it says theater fee for the high school. Does not pay one for.
So the one at Pierce Players would just remain, I believe it's the same as the activity fee.
Yeah.
At $37.50, and again, the proposal leaving it at the current rate just gives us the opportunity to do more work to see, looking at the comp districts, because when we looked at comps, it was more based at the high school and not at the middle school. And so, and then being able to look at right now, like looking at the revenue levels versus the expenses that are associated with the programs. I think for the upcoming year, just leaving it the same as it is, knowing that we've made a number of different changes in other areas with athletics, transportation, doing some adjustments to the fees, and then that will give us more time. The fees also, I think a part of the intent of charging the fees is to be able to offset the stipends that are paid. And so I think we do need to kind of do a deep dive into what the stipends are, what they represent, what the frequency is. And so that's all work that needs to happen. And that's why at this point in the year, that work hasn't happened yet. And so I don't necessarily feel comfortable being able to make a proposal based off of that data.
Similar to other things, is there, I mean, we always, we never want students to, I'm about to do a double negative. We want all students to be able to participate. So if it's a financial issue, students come to you with parents, there's a means for addressing that so that we're not.
Always has been, always will.
Okay, just.
And just to talk about that process just briefly, because it does impact, when we talk about fees, it really impacts the fees at every level.
Yeah.
Because the school lunch program has been federally funded and state funded for the past couple of years, so it's essentially a free school lunch and breakfast program. We still are encouraging families to fill out the forms that are associated with free and reduced lunch, because filling out that form, there's a portion of the information that allows us to share that information within the district. And so if the family signs off that they are okay with us sharing that information, that allows us to see which families are maybe on the free and reduced list. And then that gives us the information to be able to say, okay, these specific families are on the free and reduced list, so they do qualify for reduced fees, any reduction to transportation. So there's a whole host of, it's not just the school lunch program that the families are kind of filling out the information for. It's actually all of our fee-based programs. And so we just encourage our families to continue to go through that process, just so that we have the ability to share the information and make informed decisions on the fees. And we don't want to overcomplicate the process. We already have a way of identifying families that may qualify for any reduced fees. So that's something that we're continuing to work through, even though school lunch is and has been free for the past couple of years.
And are we doing any kind of communication about that? Like just to continually encourage families to do that so that they know like it's more than this, and that it sort of gives us that information so we don't have to go back. Okay.
So we've done very targeted, like reached out to specific families that haven't filled out the form, just to remind them, like, please fill out this form. It may benefit you in other areas rather than just specific to food service.
May I add something to that? And that also holds true for advanced placement exams and SAT and PSATs as well, because the College Board asks, for that documentation, fee waivers for college applications and everything. It really does benefit the whole student.
The whole student.
And we encourage it. the rest of the high school, the students fill out those forms to make sure they get those benefits as well.
What is our current, I know this fluctuates a bit, but I'm curious what our percentage, like, and it probably differs from athletics to AP exams, right? Like, it's probably not a constant, but what percentage of the student body is requesting?
I can't speak to all of that. It goes, because it goes through food services, I don't always see that. I mean, we do have students who are asking for those
Right.
fee waivers for a lot of those things, and we ask them to fill out forms.
Mhm.
Any questions on this? Okay, so we want to jump back to the meetings?
Sure. So for community
Thank you.
schools, so this year for our after school and before school program, we are looking at that 17% increase for the fees. You can see here, we've included the historical information of the amount that we're charging, as well as the proposal for the upcoming year, 25-26. 17% is a significant increase. But when we break down the fee that we're charging, so you can see we're providing information at yearly, monthly, weekly, daily, and hourly. And we're still extremely competitive. We're actually one of the lowest districts. The program is charging one of the lowest amounts. And so, although it's a significant increase, we do feel comfortable that the actual amount that we're charging is not unreasonable. So, and the reason that we are looking at the 17% increase is because we want the program to remain solvent. So community schools is a self-funding program. And so when we look at our projections of expenses and the projected revenue with the fee increase, we would need to increase the charges by the 17% to make sure that we're remaining self-sustaining in future fiscal years.
What's the kind of 3-year?
So if you go
17.
to the next slide, maybe, so you can see, yeah, so right now, that end of year surplus, we're looking at 895,000, and that is, so the assumption here is that we're using $250,000 as that chargeback that we've been talking about for the operating budget. With the 17% revenue increase, we're making an assumption that the cost increase will be about 6%. Our surplus at the end of next year will be 225,000. And then I didn't include it because we would have to be making kind of like an assumption for the revenue increase for 26-27. But if we did another 15% increase, our surplus would be $60,000. And then the following year, we would actually be operating in a deficit. And so we'll have to, every year, we'll have to revisit what our end of year surplus is, just to make sure, again, that this is remaining a solvent, self-sustaining program. And so the other piece of that is we built in $200,000 as it's listed as overhead on this, but it's essentially that chargeback that we talk about. It's community schools is covering expenses associated to their program that are currently hitting the operating budget. And so for next year, we have $200,000 in there. But as that amount fluctuates, that obviously has an impact on what the surplus is for the program. And so a large piece of that surplus was drawn down last year. We used over $500,000 of a chargeback to be able to cover expenses from the operating budget. So that did have a pretty significant impact on the community schools balance, which is essentially between that and kind of the program expansion that is resulting in the need to increase the fees that we're charging. And so there's one other slide that provides some more information. This is just the comps. So you can see it's we're providing comps for before school and also after school. And we plugged in the numbers for this year, or I'm sorry, the projected fees for the upcoming year. So you can see we're low. We're on the lower side, even with the large percentage increase. And so this is work I just want to, Martha Sandoval, the community schools director, she has done so much work just in looking at these numbers and looking at the fees overall, the program, making sure that the program is continuing to provide this amazing enrichment opportunities to the students. But in doing that, making sure that she truly is operating kind of in a way that her program continues to be self-sustaining. And when we look at it, we truly need to make an adjustment to the fees in order to do so.
In the long term, there's still no projected impact at this point. So, district's operating budget next year or
Correct.
even potentially following.
Mhm.
If we don't start moving the number, we're gonna have to make a dramatic
Correct.
increase in a couple of years.
And the dramatic increase either to the fees or to the program.
Yeah.
And so I think,
Well, you
so
can cut-
the,
Dramatic change.
just looking at, we had in an effort to increase that capacity, we did a lot of hiring and we did increase capacity, but we would essentially just have to scale back on the program just to do some cost containment if we were not able to increase the fees kind of in a manner to keep up with the expenses.
Salary increases were significant last year.
Can you share the 6% cost increase? Is that just based on assumed standard raises for
Yes.
employees and then standard operating?
Correct. Yep.
I'm reading it correctly. It operates at office.
Currently, yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And so the only reason, so we had a surplus for a number of years, maybe because the difference is that we weren't able to fill positions, that sort of thing.
Yes.
So then now we've drawn down on that surplus but in reality, the program costs more to run.
Correct.
Is it typical for most programs? Like I think about camps and those things, like oftentimes outside of maybe community camps, and I might not be, but like there's typically, like I'll see with kids camps, there's a rate increase every year. Is that similar? Do districts similarly for their programs adjust the rate? And
you do that. So I think with community schools, there were a number of years that we didn't increase just because the surplus was significant.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. But because I think many of the changes to the program kind of happened at one time.
Yeah.
And then we drew down on that surplus for the chargeback at a rate that was significantly higher than it had been in the past.
Yeah.
And I think doing all of those things at the same time, that's why we're kind of, with the increases, we're kind of playing catch up a little bit. But in the future, we should, as our costs increase, because it is a self-sustaining fund, our tuitions should be increasing at the same time, just so we're not doing this, okay, no fee increases, huge fee increase.
Right.
We did a 3% increase for FY 24 from FY 23. No increase last year because
Because of the
we've been gaining money, we're growing the surplus and surplus
For the
word so
fund
much. I do think it'd be helpful to see kind of the longer term, like 5-year, like
Yeah.
of how
I can
we,
share that. Sure.
yeah, just, what is our long-term plan essentially to kind of get this to stability. And then also I think there's I'd be interested to know what our current wait lists are and just like, are we actually still looking to expand capacity potentially to fill more need within the community and what impacts would that have? And maybe that's more of a conversation for next year, or not necessarily fees, fee for next year, but still, I think that what are the implications if we still have 80 kids on the wait list that would serve all those families that really want this?
I know there's been a lot of work that was done through increasing not only what we were paying our employees, but increasing the number of employees kind of through the course of last year into this year. And changing the model. So instead of just having the 5-day program, having the 5-day and then the 3 and 2. And so I think we've been able to really address the need for, or address a majority of that capacity. I think there are still schools that may have originally that had a wait list, but we're still enrolling families kind of on a rolling basis throughout the year. And so we have the registration period. There originally was a wait list. We were able to address the families on the wait list, but then families are still kind of registering on a rolling basis. And I think at that point in time, we are, in some instances, we will have a wait list just because of that rolling enrollment. But I don't think that the wait list is nearly as large or as long as it had been in the past. But we can absolutely get more information. I can talk to, again, Martha does a wonderful job of keeping track and making sure that she is trying to accommodate all families that would like to have access to the program. So I can ask her for some of the updated numbers. I know registration is going to be opening soon for next year. And so we'll have a better sense of kind of what the numbers are looking like. Even in looking at our school enrollment too, that definitely has an impact. Last year we had this really large kindergarten class, and so our enrollment in our programs increased, or the need for enrollment increased, but we should see a corresponding, adjustment next year because our class sizes aren't as large. But we can definitely, I can ask Martha, and then I don't know if it makes sense to do like almost more of like a program update, fuller program update, rather than just kind of specific to the fees and the financials.
Yeah.
That can be,
That would be good.
Did we do one in the fall? We did one last spring.
there wasn't one in the fall,
Okay.
not since I've been here.
Yeah.
But
I saw one.
Spring after budget. So,
it was, I mean, a big piece of it, what is kind of that tied to that overhead cost too. And so I think when I look at the operating budget, just saying, when we're building the operating budget, we need to build it in a way that reflects the utilization of the funding from community schools. So if we're saying we're gonna take 200,000 from community schools, that's what we're taking, and that's how the operating budget is built, and not just kind of using it as a balancing mechanism at the end of the year. That will help us more in looking at the numbers and looking at the long-term financials. Because I think that's been a variable for the program as well.
when we won't have the funds left to do it, and then we had $2 million, and that would be down.
Yeah, under a million.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, relative to the acquisition expansion, I do know, and I don't think anything has changed since I talked to Mark last, but she feels like the current size is at max capacity, so it would require something different than. Yeah, she's feeling even with hiring, all the hiring she's done and with administrative support as well.
Yeah.
The current size is kind of what with our space, with all the other considerations is kind of where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, again, to your point, it's less financially driven. The financial implications are important. Just
It's
our goal that we started talking about last year of how do we serve the community better? Like, how do we expand this because it's so important for working families and there's such demand. Maybe we are about as good as we can be. Also, as we've expanded this program, we're expanding costs for families, which then makes it harder for them. And that takes away some access potentially for some folks. So those are all balances, but I think just hearing it from her on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those details. And to your point, like there's also things that even if we're hiring more staff, we just can't change, which is the footprints of a building and like safety in terms of the number of kids we can put into those spaces.
And I think that's been a big concern, is
Yeah.
just
Yeah, I've heard
the
it
space, right?
Yeah.
And where the kids are going, and there's we do have a number of programs that are competing for the same space. So that makes it tricky. I do think that when we talk about program expansion, Martha has been wonderful about almost like looking outside of the box too, and in saying like she expanded the summer program to include Camp Tucker this year. And so I think even though it may not be specific to numbers for the wraparound programs of before and after school, she really is continuously trying to say, like, how do we better serve the community? How can we look at our programs and make sure that we're being able to provide access to whomever may want to come and participate? So I think that was one really good example of, it's not tied to this, but it is a part of the program. But she speaks, of course, she's being the director, she knows so much, she's doing so much, she sees so much, and she really tries to connect with other programs too, to kind of bring in what she's learning and bring it back to Milton. So I'm sure she'd be happy to share update.
Do we have there's no family cap. We talked about the caps for the other thing. It's just it's a tuition discount for
Correct.
siblings, so 30%. Yes.
Correct.
It's just one other question, just going back to this. So I have it right, the middle school, the 3750, we are saying, for clubs, like that is essentially mostly covers the cost of, if there is a cooking club. The fees that students pay to participate in the school would help cover that cost mostly of like what the stipend would be for that teacher. There's no reason that we would need to update that. Because I guess I just look at that and like, could we just increase that $2.50? Gain some additional revenue. I'm looking at the old fee schedule. We haven't changed. And I know we've talked about we don't want to change every fee every year. We want to try to work on this as like a rolling cycle of these sets of fees this year, these sets of fees this year, and 3-year cycle. All the fees will be adjusted.
I guess my question, and I think we do need to look at it. I'm thinking about what you said a couple minutes ago, which is around, I think it would be helpful to know the stipend piece of it, sort of how, like, is the stipend the same for every program? And are some sort of more, are some programs, after school programs more involved either from a material standpoint or from a instructional standpoint, if you will? So, and then do you look at, I just don't have a, I don't.
Kind of like we've done with sports where they're running things for
Yeah.
hockey or.
Exactly, and so is there. Is the research around sort of the stipend piece, does that drive the fee piece? Because do you know what I mean? Like, so, like sort of saying we could raise them, but I feel like we need to know what's going into it to understand. So if we are raising it, what's the realistic, what's the more, like doing it with all of that information first? Because I don't think that I have a good sense of that piece of it. And I don't know if you do, that might, and then to look, and so I think saying keeping it at this level for next year, but then whenever we're coming forward with as a proposal, it's based on. I think that would be, I would just feel better knowing the why behind it.
And that's what I think, that's the work that needs to happen that hasn't happened yet, is that right now, all of the stipends are kind of just listed out. It's just this long list, and even the stipends that we have, we don't necessarily always run all of the programs that's listed. And when I say they're listed, they're all defined in the Unit A contract in the bargaining agreement. And so we know what those rates are. We know what the clubs that run. The piece that we don't know that you can't tell is the frequency and the material cost, and kind of if it's some of the clubs and activities, there's such a wide range of kind of the time commitment, and some of them, you know, we go from we have coloring club and kazoo club, and we have those types of activities, but then we also have robotics and DECA and student gov and those activities. And I think right now it's just this long list, and there's just different rates, and it doesn't necessarily group them in frequency. So the expectation is you're meeting once a week and you're going to meet for 45 minutes, versus theater, you're meeting every day and you're meeting for 3 hours. And so I think, and that is something that Karen and I have talked a lot about, like, how do we look at this? How do we make sense of it? How do we have the stipend truly reflect the expectation of the time commitment of the size of the club? Some of the clubs may have 5 students participate. Some clubs have 80 students participate. And so we've had conversations. We know that that's a need of work that we need to do. We just haven't done it yet. And so I just want to make sure that we're doing all of that, because we may come back and say, we really think we should increase the clubs to $50, but only for these clubs. And so I'd rather just do it in a really thoughtful basis, rather than just saying, okay, my proposal is to increase by X amount. I just can't base it on anything right now. And so that was just my thought process. And looking at the student activity fees, I'm happy to, I think it is reasonable to adjust it, knowing that costs, and regardless of kind of all of that information, we know that the stipends increase by a percentage every year. So that is also one way to look at it, but there's work that we need to do, and I think we recognize that. And hopefully the proposals in future years are going to be reflective of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a more detailed more detailed look at it would be great. And I agree with you. It's work we've struggled with at my own high school, and having control this thing. The number of kids that participate, how often they participate. If they get in and do well at a competition, then it's actually more time and more cost. But how do you compensate if they do poorly? And well, then there's not as much cost. And how many staff are, like, you have 2 teachers doing it versus 1.
Right.
What's the rate at which you need the second teacher? Second club, maybe because it's safety and cooking, and you got gas, and so you want 2 teachers versus coloring. And so all those things just make it very complicated. So it's not easy work. I do think just as I look at the fee schedule, like none of these fees related to clubs have been adjusted since FY18 based on the data that has been shared. And so, in my mind, $2.50, $2.50 increase, even just for next year, like maybe that's not enough and it needs to be high. I would hesitate to do something significant for all the reasons you're talking about, but to do like a $2.50 increase on the Pierce, that's a 7% increase essentially on just something, and shouldn't, I don't think, be an undue burden on families, but it's something. And then same thing, if you do that on high school fee, that's a 10% increase. So that's percentage wise, somewhat significant, dollar wise, not super significant. I think in the moment we are in, every little thing probably helps. And
Absolutely.
then, yeah, sorry.
No, so I think that, I mean, you can do both, right? So if you were,
Absolutely.
so doing the work that you're talking about with Karen, would that be something that could impact next year? Would you say, do we do kind of what Mark is saying and recognizing the savings increase, like what's that percentage increase, and then have a look at it for next fiscal year? So
We can definitely do
that
that.
might be a way, and so then it's really, so not to rush it, but to do the work around it, but then to also, to your point, Mark, recognize it's been 6 years. So, yeah,
8 years.
8 years.
But it's a comprehensive look, right, at both the fees and the stipends.
Right.
Yeah.
It's looking at, it's holistic, yeah.
The high school club fee needs to be $50. That would be a pretty significant change there. Most of them more to your own what you're making more data.
So I can definitely do that. I could do update middle school to $40. And I think that would be consistent with activities, Pierce players. Because everything right now is $37.50 when I'm thinking about the list.
Yep.
And then high school, we could update to $27.50.
55.
55 for a cap. And then for the therapy, we could do the $100 per production with a family cap. So I can make those adjustments.
And then for the final kind of document for the I'm voted on, it should be updating the list.
Yes,
chart.
the fee
essentially.
schedule.
Okay.
And we'll do that. Is that at school committee next?
Soon next Wednesday.
Wednesday?
Yeah,
Okay.
is that something we can update and we can
Yes.
look at just one more time on Monday?
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
can take the
Mhm.
approval with Selena being here too on Monday. Good.
And then we can see, because we have had a number of changes, right? So I think to have them all on that one document. And then I think it also, if we could potentially just say like, what's next? Is there anything else that I know we had said that this was kind of going to be it for this year. But I have heard from just a few other people just in talking about the fees on that list. And so if there's anything else that we need to kind of look at and address for this year for the upcoming fiscal year, we certainly can. Or if not, then I can just update the fee schedule. But we've made a number of changes.
But weren't there a couple that we talked about when we did the piece on looking at the cost and determining some of one that was I can't remember the name of it, but is there one that we should, I think it would just be helpful to look at what the cost to run the program is, which is and see if that's something that we need to adjust.
Yeah.
Not necessarily adjust, but to know what it, I mean, I think we've talked about it, and I'm not, but I think it would just be helpful to know that are there programs that we're running that are running at a deficit?
Yes.
Just so that we know we're doing.
And we still might do that intentionally.
We might,
Yeah.
yeah, but just to know.
Just to know which programs are self-sustaining and which ones there's funding from the operating budget.
Yes, that's better.
Yeah, the only other ones I also just looking at the schedule would be the rentals. There's still a lot of like the rental fees that haven't been changed since they vary like 15, 16, 14, 17. Some we updated last year. But, so those obviously are money into that revolving fund, that is a chargeback, so it's like covering, or at least I have to cover the costs associated with the districts. And then the other one is the high school security fee, which has not changed since FY 13. So that's a small one. It's a $10 rate. I don't know what exactly that covers, and then says the security for adult and music lessons. And I see that nice gentleman every time I bring my kid in for music lessons. They're probably being paid more than $10 for that time, given that be below minimum wage. But yeah, I don't know how that's structured. That's $10 on each student, or just $10 to the program itself. Anyway, those are the only two that stick out to me, but I think both of those probably more impact the facility revolving account. So maybe that's something that we just delay to next year, because we're already significantly drawing down on that account. So I don't feel like that's one that's like negatively impacting our operational budget. I think it's being too much of a crutch. Okay. Great. Any other related things? All right. Another FY26 update, just provide here, I guess. The recording is the warrant committee approval that was received last Tuesday. At this point, so there was a vote for the warrant committee on a lot of the warrant articles, but schools was one of them, the school budget, and so that was approved by the warrant committee. Or recommended, at least it's recommended that town votes in favor of the warrant articles on overriding. So that's a Thursday. Yeah, one day last week. So that is step forward. So the next step for the budget is the override votes, and then town meeting. Another step forward. Any questions or comments on that? I know you had sent the email on just some questions on the non-override budget cuts, so let's jump to that.
So a couple of questions. One was, and is with respect to the extracurriculars. So saying that there would be, right, and it was, I think, and just want to make sure that I understand the numbers. Right now we have in we have $12,000 in there. Is there anywhere? Oh, good line.
Which is
$12,000.
That 12,000 was just residual from the initial.
That's why I was asking, like, what's the other? So, is there? So the original was to reduce. I guess
200.
It's
Right.
200. So then the whole. So the extra 12 did what?
Was essentially it was 12 of the 212 was the total number. Katie has the exact figures here. For middle school and high school.
Yeah.
So the original reduction, on the original kind of reduction list, we had put for athletics, theater, and club stipends, reducing that by 200,000. For athletics, we have a number of different accounts in the operating budget. And then for our clubs and student activities, we have one budget line that represents the stipend payments, the majority of the stipend payments. And for fiscal year 26, that was funded in the original level service budget at $212,000. And so our first kind of overall budget reduction, we had said we're going to take $200,000 from that clubs and activities line and potentially from athletics. So it was kind of the combination of those two areas in the operating budget. We also had put stipends for extracurriculars at $25,000. So that essentially is that's $225,000 from those two buckets. And then as we were looking at that further round of cuts, we added another $12,000, which would be a complete reduction of the extracurricular line. So the overall, when we look at the complete list of cuts, and I think about it from two buckets, athletics and then clubs and activities, the total reduction is $237,000. So we can look at it in two ways. We can either completely eliminate the clubs and student activity funding line, or we can take a portion from clubs and activities and a portion from athletics. And so there are a number of clubs and activities at the high school that I believe we're supposed to be running to keep our NEASC accreditation. And so I think saying that we're just cutting everything, there are activities that we may need to keep. And so in talking to Karen about the fees and kind of just clubs as a whole and all of these programs that our students have access to, I think it will be important for us to determine which one of the clubs and activities that we are supposed to keep for the NEASC accreditation. And then we would have to make a corresponding reduction potentially to athletics to be able to come up with that $237,000 reduction to the operating budget. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about athletics, we're looking at it from right now, for some of the teams we run freshman, JV, junior varsity and varsity. So we're looking at it saying, okay, what would it look like? What would the savings be if we were just running junior varsity and varsity next year and not having a freshman team? Looking at the numbers, would our students potentially be able to play junior varsity, or are we essentially saying we're eliminating that and there'll be further cuts to some of the teams in upcoming years? So that's a portion of kind of what we're looking at and the work that would need to be done when we determine exactly how much would have to be cut from athletics.
I mean, one of the wonders, I think, should be in this situation, if there are certain activities that are cost neutral.
Right.
And I think it goes back to what we were just talking about previously in terms of looking at a little bit greater granularity, what our revenue and expenses are for all of these different activities, because it would be a shame to not offer activities that are cost neutral.
Right.
I don't see any reason why we wouldn't do that.
So the other question I had is around, and this has come up, it's come up in some of the meetings, and it has to do when we're looking at some of the override, the non-override pieces. There's been a lot of discussion about special education and a number of the, and recognizing that all students are being affected 100%. Like, that's not to be understated. I just want to be sure that as we're looking at these non-override cuts that have been proposed around things that impact special education, recognizing that IEPs are written with service providers in there, not the name, but the service. Are we confident that we can meet all of the students' IEPs with these cuts? And I have to ask a question. I'm trying to ask it in a sensitive way that doesn't diminish the role of anybody that I'm asking about. But it's difficult for me to understand how we can meet a student's IEP, but then I'm looking at one of them, which is I think it's the 10 instructional assistants, which is a pretty significant number. And so I don't know how else to ask it other than to say, if we can cut and still meet students' IEP needs, then have we do we currently have instructional assistants who whose roles might have changed, and do we have more in the district than the current IEP needs warrant? So I'm not, nobody is dispensable, so I don't know how to ask that in another way, but like typically they're tied. You can have IAs in the conference room for other reasons, I understand that, and you have IAs written into an IEP, but 10 is a big number. Right, and so I guess that is just a question. So I think the bigger question is, and I just want to make sure the work is being done in some regard, that we are looking at the IEPs that are in the system and that we're able to support those students and not putting ourselves into a compliance issue with not meeting their needs. And then I guess secondly, that is a big number. So
I can speak to that, and then I've got
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I did double check with Danielle and talk through this with her. She mentioned that the 10 options are apparently students that are kind of aging out of or no longer need a instructional assistant. It is work that I think over the last 2 years, Danielle's been working on in terms of IEPs and looking at, various kind of one-to-ones that maybe don't need to be one-to-ones, and there are certain practices. I think in every district, it's something that is a national conversation too around the role of IA.
Yeah.
So I think that work, in terms of all the work she's done over the last 2 years, looking at IEPs and working with the team to look at what is the kind of instructional and support role for those positions. So that combined with what she's looking at, she feels confident that we'll be able to sustain them. I think it is a greater question, like going forward. I mean, we also do have changes at the middle school with the NEC program as well. That will result in a reduction. But I think this is not the last time we'll be talking about what is the role of IAs. That's part of the work that she's currently leading on MTSS and that framework. IAs are integral to that framework, but in a very targeted way, not in a way that I think sometimes an IA can be used. And there's lots of research on that.
Thank you.
All right, I was going to say, I do think I know you got to go. So I do think in Danielle's presentation next Wednesday, if talking about like what programming looks like next year under a non-override budget is something to speak, but both on the NEC program, I think in general, but yeah, in terms of like loss of 2 BCBAs, a 504 coordinator, to inclusion specialists, like there are lots of impacts that are like, what does that mean? Are there, to that point made at the community meeting, like any wise pound foolish.
Yes.
Excellent.
Sure.
So I'm looking at a list too. It's kind of listed in separate ways, but it says there's 4 ABA instructional assistants.
Which one are you on?
So I'm just on, the district website under the budget page. There's that chart, like that, almost like an infographic. It says there's 4 ABA instructional assistants, 10 special education assistants, and then there's also 2 preschool instructional assistants. That's tied to one of the preschool classes. So it's really 16 instructional assistants. Um, and then it's also a reduction for our kindergarten
Yes.
instructional assistants from 1.0 to 1.8, meaning that they essentially won't be there for the entirety of the day. So the classroom teacher will have a period of time where they're in the classroom with their however many.
Well, that's the other piece I would just, like, two things thinking about that. One is making sure that we're meeting the numbers, because I know especially for kindergarten, like there's a certain number of, we have to have a certain number of staff in with kindergartners. And then if there are kids who are on an IEP in that kindergarten class, that changes that. So I just want to make sure we're doing that. But I just do get, I just am concerned that we are, for lack of a better way of putting it, mapping it, because that is a lot of support. And I just would love to maybe talk a little bit more in our meeting about Peter's answer around the 10 IAs, because if it's being planned because kids are leaving, then that's.
It looks like kids can.
And kids coming in, like, I just, you know what I mean? And it could be, we will have to figure it out regardless, because our number is our number, but I just, more because the ramifications of not doing it are, we have to meet it, and it's much more expensive, and it's just not the right thing to do or not, so.
I think it's when we, of course, going back to the budget, when we talk about the budget and thinking about we're always living in the three budgets, right? When I think about what had happened in fiscal year 24, a portion of the deficit for fiscal year 24 was tied to the fact that we had added a significant number of instructional assistants. And I think that we all just need to be mindful of that, because we can't be living in fiscal year 26 in the type of scenario where we've cut these positions from the budget, but then there's a need, right? There's an identified need. It may even be a need that we don't know about right now. It could be a student that hasn't even registered yet, but when that need arises, we have to be able to address the need. We can't address the need in the fashion that we've done in the past, because that in some instances has led us to have that deficit. And so that's just has to be the recognition of, yes, we say that we're federally mandated to deliver the services on the IEPs, but we also are going to have to live within that budget. And so I think it's just, I just want us all to be, and I say that more from that's from my perspective, right? And the school side saying that's going to be a piece of the work that we do to say, yes, of course, we'll have to deliver the services, but we're also having to live within what appropriated to us.
And I think this is a conversation that we've talked about having, but again, it's that every year the calibration, like that recalibration of sort of across this still needed more here, the population moved, or we got across, not just in special ed, but I think that's to that point. Like in 24, we were well short of those. We needed them. Students move, things change. Just looking at them, and how can we reallocate services or resources that we have to where they're needed if they're not needed.
Yeah, I think to your point though, it's just critical work that district staff have to be doing, and it's the lens that you and I are going to be able to have. And so I think the question is good, and so I think Danielle, they gotta make sure that what we need to do, we cannot what we need in order to buy legally required services for kids. So expectations, that's not a situational thing, but as we talked about, just being, you're raising here, being conservative somewhat within our expectations around special education costs, because we know they have been unexpected. So that it's, we talked about in the FY26 building that into those assumptions. That we are trying to not anticipate a best case scenario that is not which is kind of courtesy of past years.
Yeah.
So, anything else? All right, move down, on the, meeting minutes approvals. I sent out the meeting minutes in the last 2 weeks, so we had March 24th, March 26th, March 31st, and April 2nd. Any feedback? Okay. And I will make a motion to approve the Finance Committee meeting minutes for March 24th, March 26th, March 31st, April 2nd. Is there a second? All in favor? And then our next meetings are 4/14, 4/16, and 4/30. So next one's for the rest of the month. For 16, we've already talked about, we're gonna do the quarter 3 report. 4/30, we'll debrief the override. At that point, we'll know if the override passed or not, and so we can at least have some conversation on moving forward, if there's not override budget by a little bit that morning together. 4/14, we talked about kind of the final fee schedule review, where you'll share that full document, all fees meetings. So we'll do that again on Monday. Notes to vote on that. Anything else we should be talking about?
I'm sorry, did you say?
The quarterly report next Wednesday.
Thank you, sorry.
Anything else? All right. And that's it. And with that, I will make a motion to adjourn the meeting at 9:15. All in favor? Thank you so much.